Already it is twilight down in the Lauredito. Bats fly forth from their roostings in courthouse and tower and circle the quarter. The air is full of the smell of burning charcoal. Children and dogs squat by the mud stoops, and gamecocks flap and settle in the branches of the fruit trees. They go afoot, these comrades, down along a bare adobe wall. Band music carries dimly from the square. They pass a water cart in the street and they pass a hole in the wall where by the light of a small forge fire, an old man beats out shapes of metal. They pass in a doorway a young girl whose beauty becomes the flowers about. Hey, JVH.
Hi, Candy.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. Well, we're at chapter 3.
Wow.
I can't
What
believe it.
Meridian now?
I know, and I'm really enjoying it. I'd like to do something though that has been bothering me since last episode, chapter 2.
Oh,
It's
what's
the
that?
line where the hermit says, a mind cannot know itself. It's only got its mind to know itself with. And I was thinking, I think what bothered me about it was that is totally not Gnostic thinking. I'm not sure if he's a reliable narrator. I took it very seriously most of the times I read it, but for some reason, these past few days, it's just haunting me. And I just kind of wanted to say that. Um, the
What
other
makes you
thing,
think he's not being that makes you think he's being disingenuous or something?
well, I just think that's his wisdom. That's his knowledge. I don't know if it's world knowledge. I think because he was a slaver, because of the heart and his morality, and that he brags about it, he boasts about it. I'm not sure why I want to take what he said so seriously. That that a mind is only ought to know itself. It can't because of its own existence. And in Gnosticism, it is the mind is the only way you can get out of this um, set of illusions that we're in this world, and they depend, and Gnostics, we depend on being able to use our mind and focus it on not on knowing the nature of reality, that this is an illusion. So I just want to throw that out there.
Hmm.
Since the book has been called Gnostic, I just wanted to put that out there. There's something else I wanted to say, because remember I said I might regret about everyone having an opinion and everyone's opinion is right. I want to qualify that as I think this novel is how Terence McKenna would describe Finnegan's Wake. It's like a dipstick. You dip it in and you pull out what's in your mind. So you're
Yes,
drawing what you know. And really the way to read it is to keep digging. Your first impressions or your main impressions might be just what you're coming to the book with. Not every novel is like that because some novels spell it out. So I just kind of wanted to throw those two things out as a kind of a callback from last week.
that's great. I agree with that. Like depiction of the book as something that like interrogates the reader
Yes.
rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And the interpretation of the reader is almost it's almost like a trap because the reader passes judgment on the text, but the text may be passing judgment back onto the reader without the reader's awareness, depending on, you know, um, I guess their level of engagement with it.
Hmm. I've also thought of the novel, and it fits with Terence McKenna as well, as being a bit of like a psychedelic tool, is that you enter it and it resets and reboots your consciousness to go into to some of the descriptions are great descriptions of the nature of reality, which we're going to be traveling through as we go further in the novel. But I just kind of wanted to throw that stuff out.
That's
So,
great. Yeah.
how did you feel about chapter 3?
Well, I mean, I also kind of wanted to start out kind of just with a quick rear view look at back at chapter two because,
Hmm.
you know, when rereading chapter two from the last episode, I was noticing how the chapter was essentially kind of framed around the idea of blackness or, African Americanness, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
The first encounter in that chapter is with the slaver, and the last encounter in that chapter is with the kid looking for his mule and asked directions from three slaves. It's kind of interesting, like it was very interesting to me then reading chapter three, following chapters to sort of like focus on blackness in a way, or framing the chapter around the idea of blackness. That chapter three is kind of all about whiteness, or maybe to put it in
Mm,
a better way, like the ideology of white supremacy, or, to use a term from a historian, Reginald Horseman, American racial Anglo-Saxonism. You know, I thought, and it sort of links whiteness to ideas of masculinity and nationalism and sexuality and violence in incredibly intricate ways, and again, just marveling at the artistry of the novel, where we get these chapters that are fairly, low key, there's nothing kind of really seems to be happening too much on the surface, and yet all of the kind of um, major themes are being introduced in very kind of understated, and I would say kind of deadpan, hilarious ways. Like there's a lot of humor in this chapter that I don't know, it might not be so evident, if you read too quickly.
mhm.
And again, just going off of this sort of idea that chapter three is in some ways about whiteness. I mean, how can I say that? Well, the very first encounter that the kid has is with a soldier, and the very first thing that soldier says is, "I'm white,
Mhm.
I'm Christian."
Mhm.
And who is that soldier? Well, he works for somebody named Captain White.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
it's
what kind of horse does he ride? He rides a horse that has a white blaze on its
a white
face,
face.
four
Yeah,
white
white face.
stockings on, you know,
Mm,
on its hooves. So like the sort of like excessive use of the term white for
mhm,
like proper
mhm.
names and for things characters say, and for even like aspects of other things like horses. It just seems, super overemphasized. And in that respect, it's really kind of funny.
Well, it is kind of funny, and this is why you inspire me so much. That was right over my head, and I see it plain as day now. I definitely, when I sent you some notes and you sent me some notes, I did laugh that we had really picked out
Yeah.
a lot of the same things. Like, I'm white and Christian. I was like, yeah, that would have maybe been a turnoff to me. And we copied a part that we will maybe read out again about that when they sit and meet Captain White, because we both reacted to the body language. Um, which I thought was humorous. And yeah, but I didn't think of if chapter two being surrounded, bookend by blackness and this chapter, white supremacy. And, you're right that he really is. What struck me was when Captain White is talking, that it could have been someone in the Oval Office talking. I was struck by, oh my God, this is the same kind of talking and language that is happening in the government right now. And it's alarming. I always thought that guy was a joke when I read the novel. And this time I'm like, I thought, oh, it's archaic, it's out of fashion, nobody would talk that way. Well, boy, is it topical now, this chapter.
I mean, he is a joke
Yeah.
in so many ways. And I mean, obviously, we're reading this novel having read it before, right? So we're actually rereading the novel.
Yes.
We know the dramatic irony of this chapter and of Captain White's bluster,
Hmm.
right? It's all going to be for naught, because he's just going to end up as a head pickled in a jar. That's his fate, right? And
And
so,
a good fate it is.
and like his confidence is really hilarious, and his assertiveness is really hilarious in many ways. Like he says things like, "Mark my words, Sonora will be a U.S. state, or the Guaymas will be a U.S. port," and of course, to this day at least,
Hmm.
um,
It's
none
not.
of that is true, right?
None of
Like,
that is true. Correct. Correct. I was thinking people say that this is like a dry, dusty Moby Dick. It's his response to Moby Dick. Well, here we should learn about the transmission of ideas through the whale. Here we have it that whiteness should be something we're looking for. And
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So
I
to me,
mean,
that's one of the most direct lines right there. Um,
I think Melville describes, whiteness or the whiteness of the whale as the colorless all color of atheism or something like that, which is funny considering I'm white and Christian and,
mhm,
the
mhm.
again talking about identity formation and the intersection of various elements in American masculine identity, especially,
Yes.
whiteness, nationalism, Christianity, all of these things kind of combine to create this completely toxic figure
Mhm.
who is a joke, but I agree, totally no joke. He's a
Right.
demagogue, and demagoguery has
Mhm.
not changed in 100 years, which is really kind of, a little bit on the depressing side or a little bit
Yes.
on the enraging side, maybe.
Yes. Yes. And maybe, yeah, we think we're beyond something, we're not. We think we've transcended, we haven't. Um,
Yeah, and that may be one of the ways that the text judges the reader, right?
yes.
The reader who
Yeah.
thinks that this is just history, right?
Mhm.
It's not then and now in a relationship,
Mhm.
it's just then and we're now and we're different, we're better, we've progressed.
Mhm.
Um, None of that is obviously true. And speaking of the lack of truth,
Truth, I
I
know because we both were laughing about the lying going on. What happened?
It's the conversation between the Captain White and the kid is
Mm,
it is a real joy to read, like
it
in so
is.
many ways.
Yes.
Like it is two liars talking to
Yes.
each other, each after their own agenda and pretending to get along or pretending there's a conversation, a real back and forth. To me, they're like, again, you mentioned Herman Melville, and I'd like to talk about Moby Dick too a little bit later as well, but also The Confidence Man, which is
Oh, yes.
a novel that I'll harp on for the rest of this podcast, I'm sure. But, these are two confidence men. And
Hmm.
even in Melville's novel, like every chapter in a way is a kind of conversation between uh, in essence, two kinds of confidence men.
True.
So it is really funny, yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, but the lying is different. Captain White lies, and that means one thing, and the kid lies. I think that means another thing.
Right. I think White is probably trying to be a recruiter and, father figure. Come on, young men. We're gonna set you up. How come you're so dirty and filthy? You deserve to be, taken care of. And the kid, I'm not sure why he lies, except maybe shame that he is such a wreck in front of these clean people. And he sees a monetary reward. He definitely sees, wow, if I go with these guys, I get a horse, I get a saddle, I get maybe my boots repaired or and a bath. So he's like seen like
The
he wants.
bath being the lowest on the list
That's
of
right. Yeah,
priorities.
yeah. That's true. Top of my list, but bottom of his. Um, I wanted to read it one more little section when they sit down. So they go into Captain White's office, and this is the part where I think both of us laughed as well, and I'm sure other people have as too. They eased themselves into a kind of settle made from some dark wood. The captain's man had a large revolver at his belt, and as he sat, hitched the belt around so that the piece lay cradled between his thighs. He put his hat over and leaned back. The kid folded his busted boots one behind the other and sat upright. I mean, the body language says it all. And the kid has got a feminine. It's women who cross their ankles generally, culturally, at least here. I don't recall very many men that would sit that way. In general, especially, maybe on a podium if they had to. But it's so brilliant, the phallicness of that gun.
It's hilarious. Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is. And like you always have to ask why does a writer Why did they decide to keep that sentence in? Why did they write it in the first place? And it seems like a kind of throwaway detail of no great significance, but when you start like putting all the pieces of the chapter together, this is obviously a kind of a weird conflation of, the phallus and the
Mhm.
gun, a sort of conflation of sex and violence, which is, maybe unavoidable in terms of a certain kind of idea of masculinity, which, nowadays we might call toxic or hyper masculinity. Uh, it's also really funny how, masculinity isn't really something that's natural. It's something that might be, I might just be going back to what is now kind of an old idea about gender performativity, but the captain is very theatrical. He twirls he has a very nice mustache. He's very performative in his attempt to get the kid to do what he wants,
Yeah,
which
and on that note, I thought, why did we hear about the sealing wax? This the sealing wax, the red.
beautiful,
It's like
beautiful
blood.
discussion.
It's got a little blood thing, so it's another foreshadowing. There's a lot of foreshadowing, and it's the Mennonite in chapter 2, and or is that this chapter? Oops,
No, that is this chapter.
that is this chapter. That's right. But you've got that blood dripping onto the paper, and it's so formal, and it has to be so foreign to the kid. So maybe there's that beautiful theater of him doing that. And you're right, it's performative because a lot of the military is. My dad said, and I thought about this with the kid. My dad used to say, I was like, why'd you go in the army, Dad? Why'd you go in the military? He goes, listen, when you're 18 and poor, that first day, you've got a check. You've got money, you've got new clothes. You know you're going to buy a car in a couple of weeks, and three square meals. And I was like, it's a little bit like the Chris Rock joke. It's a very old joke. He's like, you got an old ghetto and a new jail. Guess what looks pretty good? The new jail has beds. You get some quiet time, alone time. You get three square meals, and you've got clean clothes on. You know, and it seems like because he met two other groups that maybe he could have stayed with in the previous chapters, the kid.
That's right. Yes.
Why
Yeah.
is he going with this one? They asked him. That might be part of it. He was invited, but it's interesting that there's a real monetary, he gets to get a little upscale.
Yeah, 100%. And that sort of like makes me think of like the difference between Captain White's lies, let's say, and the kid's lies. And I kind of like the way the kid is lying in the sense that
Yeah.
he's basically fictionalizing
Yeah.
his prior experiences, right? Like he just like takes what happened to him. I think, maybe it was the slaver anchorite who said something like, "This is just a wilderness place."
Mm.
And so the kid said, "I was beset by robbers in a wilderness place." And
Yes.
then, he describes the robbers basically like the herders that he met and who gave him,
I know. And the
he
poor
says like,
herders.
they only left me with this little knife, which is true. They did leave him that knife, but it wasn't like they stole everything else and they just didn't steal that.
Right.
He had nothing and they gave him that.
Right. Right.
So he's like his lying is like, you know, from the point of view of like a social hierarchy, bottom up, right? He's
Yes.
lying to
Yeah.
survive.
He is
And
lucky. Yeah.
Captain White is like a demagogue, and he's, in some sense, utilizing his position in the social hierarchy and maybe also his education a little bit. Like he kind of like, do you know that? Did you know this? Did you know that? And he's dropping all of these names that he could obviously tell the kid would have no idea who these people are. The Governor Burnett of California, or the Monroe Doctrine, or, Colonel Carrasco, like he's just dropping kinds of military names that why would the kid know anything? But maybe Captain White is thinking that this will impress him.
Right. Yeah. 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 It's a real sales pitch. Definitely. definitely. But I did laugh. Like, what did those herdsmen do to you that you had to throw them under the bus?
Yeah.
Damn, damn.
Yeah,
You're talk
like it, sorry.
I was gonna say, so he does his sales pitch. He tells him what it's about. The kid tells the story, his lies, and then he says to the recruiter, "Sign this man up." I actually felt exhilarated because I did feel good. He's gonna have a bath and he's gonna get his shoes fixed. I was really like, he needs to get this fixed.
It's true.
And it reminded me, and I wanted to ask you this too. Again, remember with the hermit, he says, "Go out and get your saddle because something will eat it." Why
Right.
won't the mule? I mean, I don't understand what's eating the saddle. So maybe our listeners can answer that for me.
That's true. Yeah, I don't know why the mule didn't think of that.
Yeah, yeah. Will the mule walk away or what? I don't know. The kid
Yeah.
changes the way he speaks too. He gets through it. He's like all slang and casual. By the end of it, he's yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. He knows the drill.
Yeah.
He's getting what he wants, so he's gonna get what they want.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
But like whiteness can't doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? I mean, it can only be defined through other ideas of race,
Mm.
obviously through ideas of blackness, um, and indigeneity.
Hmm.
But it's also kind of interesting the way that, Captain White is talking about Mexico and Mexicans.
Oh, terrible.
He calls Mexicans like a race of degenerates or a mongrel race, and that kind of, to me, reflects 19th century American expansionist discourse, about, or just about anti-Mexican discourse in the 19th century. You know, Mexico is also a European colonial
Right.
settler project, right?
Right.
But, from the Anglo-Saxon point of view, or the American Anglo-Saxon point of view, what makes Mexicans less than Americans is the perception that the Mexican as a national identity is not just Spanish or Portuguese, but also, or South Americans are not
Mm,
just Spanish or Portuguese, but they're, mixed with indigenous and black, right? So
absolutely.
the Mexican is a mongrel race from Captain White's point of view, because of these kind of racial interminglings that he supposes exist in the Mexican. The irony is, like, which is kind of erased from the final draft of the novel, is that in the earliest drafts, the kid is described racially as a mix of
Mm.
Irish and Saxon and Mexican or
Hmm.
Spanish,
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Interesting.
he is himself, the kid is a
Yeah.
racially mongrel or
Yes.
racially, like mixed. And so,
Yes.
um, yeah, so it's really interesting he the way Captain White has to essentially kind of understand whiteness through other racial categories. Otherwise, it's just totally meaningless.
Hmm. Hmm. And it might also be why the kid starts really fitting in so fast. There could be some shame, or look, I'm white too.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm gonna deny my mixed race.
and the kid uses an anti-black slur in his conversation with Captain White, and Captain White responds to the kid with the same anti-black slur, and this is like a coin that is passed between them to establish their kind of bond, right? They bond over their racial identity as white or something like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
But
Very, very interesting that, for hearing about him speak so poorly of Mexican state and Mexican people. And, of course, this week in Chicago, we've got ICE officers going through the
oh
city,
my God.
probably all over the place, but people weren't showing up to some of their jobs. They were afraid they were going to get arrested. But you want to go against Mexican people and human beings. Well, I don't know. You may have a struggle ahead of you because on the news, and there were kids who had piñatas made out of made to look like ice officers and they're banging on them with candies inside. So who's going to win this battle? It's pretty interesting that I'm seeing this in such a different light right now. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. Um, we find out that the troop, so he leaves the Captain White's. I don't know if we're moving on, but he leaves Captain White's. He's going to get signed up. He's about to go and get, maybe a belt or a horse or something. And there's some comedy in here too, because one, the guys aren't happy. The company of soldiers are not very happy, or mercenaries, I suppose,
yeah.
are not very happy. And they have these painted ponies, these painted horses. My girlfriend Jenny, she used to have them. They're just a beautiful horse. But they're jumping around and acting crazy, and they've only been broken for 40 days. And there's a really good line in there of like, one of the guys goes, "Wait till you get to one. You ain't never had no fun." Because you're going to be jumping around and the horse is not going to listen to you. It's going to be unpredictable. I just love that vision. You ain't never had no fun.
Well, I mean that the idea of like the common soldier complaining while the the top brass like are deliberating, that goes back to, that's in every ancient Greek tragedy. Yeah,
Yeah, you're right.
But could I go back a little bit to
Yes,
Captain
yes.
White's speech, because again, trying to kind of think through this sort of the way that McCarthy is kind of putting together ideas of whiteness and masculinity and violence and nationalism. Like I love Captain White's speech because it's just so full of shit. And when you sort of read, like, you look into the mentions of like the things that Captain White is mentioning, it becomes the connections between these elements become even more apparent. So White mentions the Monroe Doctrine,
Mm,
and I'm not like a historian or a historical literary critic at all. I just like enough history to, help me with the poetics of the thing or something like
mm,
that.
mm,
But the Monroe Doctrine was like, it has been kind of like a nationalist symbol since like 1823, when, U.S. President James Monroe gave an annual message to Congress, which basically proclaimed to the domestic audience that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European colonization and political intervention.
mm,
So when Captain White talks about, oh, there are all these French settlers, and one day this continent will fly a European flag, Monroe Doctrine or no, he's kind of basically stirring up fears of European intervention in the New World, and fears of well, I mean, America is not exactly the military powerhouse that it now is,
mhm.
um, such that it can threaten, to annex Canada and Greenland and Panama and apparently now Gaza.
And South Africa too, I think.
So the Monroe Doctrine is sort of like this contested political symbol that lived far beyond 1823 and becomes a kind of a speech that also indicates the emergence of print culture in the US at the
Mm,
time, and the way that print culture led to kind of cults of celebrity, and especially celebrities of the great man. So there's a historian by the name of James Sexton who writes celebrants of the 1823 message grafted Jacksonian and then Civil War notions of manhood onto Revolutionary era tropes of great man leadership, creating in the process a hypermasculine cross-generational Monroe Doctrine. So, I
mm,
mean, all of Captain White's mentions are, just feed into the way McCarthy is like conflating ideas of masculinity and nationalism and race in really interesting ways.
mm.
And yeah, anyway, all of
Very
these
good.
all of these kind of little throwaway names are super interesting.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
he mentions a Mexican general at one point,
Oh, I know who you're
Colonel
gonna say.
Carrasco,
Oh my
who
God.
and Carrasco led a massacre against the Apache that led to the killing of Geronimo's wife and children. And so Geronimo always hated the Mexicans after that, right? And he warred against Mexico.
Mm,
It's a weird way. It kind of reminded me of Glanton, who I think
mm,
maybe in Blood Meridian, or maybe that's in my confession, where he's described as being having been bereft of wife and children by a raid of Apache or something like that. And so he hates, Indians.
mm,
And so, he has this kind of primal hatred the way that Geronimo does. And Geronimo is kind of half sort of there in sort of like the cloud of associations around this name of Colonel Carrasco. So, McCarthy probably knew all this, right? And he's just kind of creating this um, wonderful web of associations.
and it's a wonderful portrayal of what would interest people. It's almost like the news. They've heard the news, they've read this paper, maybe they're getting it 2 months later, but you know, the culture, the culture, the mindset, the court of public opinion exists then too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
fascinating.
propaganda machine was already up
Correct.
and running.
Correct. Correct.
But yeah, like I mean, the passage you wrote in, or
Mm.
sorry, the passage you read aloud at the
Yes.
beginning of the
Yes.
episode,
Yes.
beautiful passage and a weird moment in, this three-section chapter where the tense changes from the past tense to the present tense. Like suddenly we're not reading the story of the kid as if it happened in the past, but we are experiencing a present moment with him, and I found that really kind of that shift in grammatical tense to be kind of interesting as well.
Mhm. And again, deepens our relationship and interest in his story. We're definitely bonding with him, for better or for worse. For better. I mean, he's a character. He's definitely a character. So they get set up and they um get all this gear and we come across another weird guy, another interesting philosopher, if you will. Kind of maybe he is a bookend to the anchorite, but we get the Mennonite.
Right, the old disordered Mennonite.
Yeah, it's weird. I have notes from quite a while ago that the chapter three begins with three characters, three men in a tent, the kid and two others. They go to town, they meet the one Mennonite, one dies, and ends and the chapter ends again with a kind of a feeling of three going in and out. And I always found that kind of interesting. There's another line in there. It's the first time we come across seven or eight. The kid's giving the example of robbers and he says seven or eight. And I always remember that struck me. And it happens about three times in the novel, maybe more. I'll look in my past research on it, but it's an interesting thing. Seven or eight kind of indicates the number 56, which is a pretty interesting number because you can add up the first prime numbers up to 56. But
Hmm.
it also is that we can't count. We can't count with our eyes. We can only count with our eyes up to four. And I love the realism of that, that we can see three apples and we'll know it's three. But after four, we don't know how many it is, so it's seven or eight.
Hmm.
After four, you actually have to stop and go, oh wait, that's one, two, three,
Yes,
four, five,
yeah.
six apples, right? You won't know. It's many apples, but it's not a number unless you take time. It's just physically impossible. That's why we do the gate post back to our notches. We do those gate posts with a four and then a slash, and people do it all over the world as
Right,
well, so that you can
right, yeah.
you can log in quantities of five, but you can't read more than four. So they put the slash across it to make five, or we do, not they. I just really loved it, and also there's a figure eight. which really kind of made me think of infinity and another signpost for the tarot. Is infinity on the magician?
Yes.
Yes. So I wanted to remember that too. Um, it could be a hint towards tarot again, like the three of cups, maybe the four of cups in last chapter.
Well, isn't eight also, I mean, I'm not a super subscriber to the Gnostic McCarthy idea, but isn't eight all, I mean, there's eight is also the Ogdoad, right? Which is
Ogdo,
a
that's coming up, yep.
yeah.
Which is an
Um,
astrological timekeeping um, artifact. And it's pretty cool that he calls it. That brings up that thing again I was saying last week about self-similarity in the titles, because I don't think they say Ogdode in the novel. It's in the chapter, synoptic chapter
yes, yes,
titles.
yes,
And I
exactly.
always find that really fun because the thing about self-similarity in nature and in math, and you mentioned holograms, also pixels. The revolution in filmmaking was that pixels are self-similar. So you can generate coastlines, mountains, skies by using the math of a fractal, right? Or Mandelbrot, if you will,
Right.
whatever frame of reference you prefer, or our listeners are used to. And something like a stupa or a Persian rug, but particularly a stupa, it's scaffolding information. So when you have self-similar, you can add way more information. The bottom of a stupa has squares, and each of those squares can be used as multiples of four. And this goes back to the Mennonite saying something about the mind, because not the Mennonite, the anchorite, the hermit, because for me, blood meridian is an example of distributed cognition. And distributed cognition is sort of like extended mind theory, where the mind doesn't just live in the body, it lives in our artifacts, our tools, and our literature and our art. And we don't keep it all in the body. It's actually not just, maybe most of the mind is in the world, actually, and very little of it is in our body, according to the theory of distributed cognition. So I wanted to just kind of get back to that with the number eights coming up and such, and the
Well,
Ogdode.
there,
You mentioned the Ogdode, so that's pretty cool.
yeah, and like there are other self-similar things I think going on in this chapter. Like, for example, there we have the first mention of a harness maker.
Hmm?
And of course, like one of the judge's most interesting stories has to do with a harness maker.
Mm.
We have this again. You read out that passage where there's this old man by a fire beating out shapes of metal. Well,
Mhm.
isn't that sort of like the cold forger in the kid's dream at the end of the novel? So we have this kind of like layering, like like a incredible like lacquered katana or something like that. That it's just layer after layer after layer carefully put together. And in a way, like you could say that, well, all of this is kind of redundant, right? It's just redundancies.
Mm.
And from a point of view of like information theory, you want to get rid of redundancies as much as possible and just communicate the information. But from a poetic point of view, redundancy and repetition is actually something that's really important. Like repetition can create emotional emphasis. It can, repeating something never the same way twice can, sink us into the thing that we're, in a much more expansive kind of way. So it's, again, because we're rereading this, we're not
Mhm.
reading it.
Right.
And which is absolutely crucial to the reading of this novel. It
Yeah.
should be reread. It should not, well, you have to read it once,
Yes. You have
but
to
then
read it
you have
once.
to reread it.
Yes.
And then you're really reading it when
Yeah.
you're rereading it.
Yeah. Well, I like what you say about it doesn't surprise me that a facet of science would not understand the importance of repetitiveness. Although you have to repeat your math notes when you're a kid and memorize all that. But part of initiation and sacred space and sacred practice is repetition or incantatory. So it's this novel reeks of that. We are being initiated. And if you're already initiated, you recognize things in this book. So we're going full circle to the beginning of this, of me saying about, spots and things that are sticking out. But yeah, the repetitive thing is helping us learn. And when you have repetitive things, then when you have a surprise, the novelty really helps you learn, really helps it sink in, and you could possibly have a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
That's research, thousands of years of research before McCarthy wrote this novel of wisdom and knowledge of how to tell a story, how to perform magic, and how to initiate people, and he's utilizing all of those things.
Wonderful. Yeah. Um, the Mennonite is also really interesting to me because Mennonites are pacifist,
Yeah,
you
you're right.
know, and so of course the kid has to ignore the Mennonites' advice in many respects. Well, does ignore
It
the
does, yeah.
completely, and like the chapter ends with the Mennonite saying something about there's no joy um, in the tavern as there is on the road to the tavern, right? And which echoes to me a couple of moments in chapter 3 where the narrator kind of like asserts a kind of commentary or reflection on the action. Usually the narrator is just narrating, but every once in a while, kind of like, a Homeric narrator will sort of remove themselves and reflect on what's going on. And
Mm,
this happens twice in the novel where we get these kind of sort of generalized reflections like how many youths have come home cold and dead from just such nights and just such plans, or how these things end, right? Like, um, the narrator is basically reflecting, or is reflecting on the events almost to me, it seems like from the same perspective as the Mennonite, who's a pacifist,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
which, like Joyce, when he wrote Ulysses, that was like he was often, I think, wondering to himself, why hasn't there ever been like an epic of peace
mm-hmm.
written, right? And so Ulysses, in some ways, is like that.
Mm,
It's peace in a way. Like there's conflict, obviously, but it's not an epic of war. So we might ask, well, why does McCarthy coming after Joyce and apparently admiring Joyce so much, why does he revert back to uh, writing an epic of war?
Well,
But
I
I
think,
think we can only understand that if we understand that the epic of peace is also kind of underlying this and
mhm.
providing a sort of countercurrent to what's literally happening.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's again why it's on us as a reader to be, and why we're doing this podcast, to be very careful to know what is this novel, what's going on with it. Are we worshiping violence? Are we worshiping, this kind of idea that we, have to dog eat dog and everything? Is that the message? I don't know. We're going to find out. I don't think that is the message, but
I
we're going
think
to
we're
find
on the
out.
same page.
There's some more beautiful descriptions that I think you kind of inspired me to pay attention to. Um, right in the section where he's getting his kit put together. Um, right before he meets um, they're talking to some Texans and the different types of people that are in this
Oh, right.
town,
Yeah,
remember?
yeah.
Different
Yeah,
types of,
exactly. It's a
he's
beautiful,
running
it's
into,
another,
yeah, he's
yeah, it's
running,
another like sort of like uh picture of, democratic pluralism
yes,
almost sort of,
yes.
like yeah, and like I was telling you before, that description where we read with immigrants and Texans and Mexicans,
Mm,
with slaves and Lipan Indians and deputations of Karankawas, tall and austere, their faces dyed blue and their hands locked about the shafts of their 6-foot spears, all but naked savages who with their painted skins and their whispered taste for human flesh seemed outrageous presences even in that fabled country company. I ran out of breath because
yes.
that last part of this polysyndeton and
Mm,
phrase is so long, right?
hmm.
It's actually kind of, why does he pay so much attention to the Karen Kawas? I probably not pronouncing that right, but that reminded me of, again, like the description of the crowd in The Confidence Man. So like The
Mhm.
Confidence Man is this novel about a steamboat that sails from St. Louis to New Orleans, and basically, it's just following a bunch of grifters, right? Trying to con people out of their money.
Yeah.
And, Melville kind of gives a description of the crowd on the steamship in a very similar way, like he talks about it as a piebald parliament, an anacharsis cloots congress of all kinds of that multiform pilgrim species man, and he talks about the streams of the most distant and opposite zones, pouring them along helter-skelter in one cosmopolitan and confident tide. So that again, we get sort of like the herders, right? This sort of
Definitely.
like image of a plurality of people all in one place,
Mhm.
which is really beautiful.
It is so beautiful. It's a great sentence. It also struck me as kind of Dickensian, just this, this or like Gangs of New York or something, this crazy patch of people. And then, bless your heart, you got us to watch a movie. It was really one of the most incredible movies with this tribe in it. And you know
Yeah,
what? Cormac's description of them is dead on in
it's
the
pretty,
because
it's
right away I knew why you wanted me to watch the film as soon as we run into them. I'm like, oh my God. It was
yes.
because it's a very, let's talk about the film quickly, but it was a very timeless movie. It's like I could relate to it, and it seemed very much like Blood Meridian. It could be almost Blood Meridian in a weird way. Just for the vibe of it and the energy and the lack of technology
Yes.
or different. I should be, listen to me being ethnocentric. Um, a different technology than we use. There was lots of tech. There's lots of
Yeah,
technology.
exactly.
Yeah, what am I
Yeah,
talking
so
about?
like, part of the interesting thing about the novel is that, I could critique the novel like I might critique, a Vietnam War film,
Mhm.
like what was Kubrick's film about the Vietnam War
Full
again?
Metal Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket. In some sense, it is a kind of an anti-war film,
Mhm.
but it's only from the perspective of the American soldiers, and it's not Homeric in the sense that it doesn't give equal time to the Vietnamese or the Viet Cong.
That's true.
The way that Homer will give kind of equal time to both the Greeks and the Trojans.
Mm.
And Blood Meridian, in some senses, mostly focalized on the American perspective of the kid, right? And so we don't get a lot of indigenous perspectives. We do get a lot of, slurs and slang words and, improper words, like Indian doesn't really describe anything according to, an Anishinaabe theorist like Gerald Visner, who says it's just a colonial invention, or it's
Yes.
a simulation because it makes things happen.
Mhm.
But so like when McCarthy will use like his characters terms like savages, right? But then he uses very specific indigenous groups and names of nations like
Mhm.
the Karankawas.
Mhm.
Um, and so, I have to do, whenever I see a weird word like whisket, I have to like look it up. And so like the Karankawas were um, nomadic indigenous nations. I think it was, at least five different kind of interlocking groups along, the sort of southern coastline.
Mhm.
And as I was doing research, I realized, oh, this is the group of indigenous people that Cabeza de Vaca
Mhm.
traveled with in the 1520s to when his ship got shipwrecked and he basically like had to live with indigenous groups for a period of 8 years. And that reminded me of this amazing early 90s film by the Mexican director Echevarria, Cabeza de Vaca. So I'm like, oh, Candy, you
Oh,
got to watch this movie. This is so cool.
Yeah, thank you for saying the title. It was so good and so fantastic. It's one of my favorite films, and it also reminded me of a film. And I know this guy's out of favor too, but we'll get back to the artist and the art. But Apocalypto, which is a stunning movie, incredible. And but Cabizo de Vaca, what a movie! The cinematography, the makeup, the it felt so authentic, and it felt so made with love and respect for his country. And I have to now watch everything he makes. And I guess he lived with he lived for 2 years with an indigenous tribe in Mexico, and I guess he made some films about that. So I have to do a deep dive on that. But what a beautiful movie. It's so funny when they get the shipwreck. We were laughing because he goes, "Oh, here we are in India." It's like, oh, dude, you were so far away from India.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean it's amazing, and like the it's so good because like you as the viewer are just as confused as
oh,
Kabiza de Vaca. What's
very,
going on? Like
very. It's otherworldly. It's so gorgeous and so, I mean, I could see seeing it on a big screen for sure. I mean, my TV's pretty big, but because I'm a media whore, but it, but it's, man, it was gorgeous. We had to turn off the lights and we're like, we didn't move. It was so compelling. What a great film. And I think like I said, in some weird way, I felt like I'd really entered this kind of s- perspective of Blood Meridian. It gave me a new insight to it, and definitely to see the tribe being portrayed at the beginning. And it's at the beginning of the film. I think he goes with a few different tribes and a few
yes, he does. Yeah.
different
Yeah.
cultures and societies. But that first one, I was like, well, I know who these guys are.
Yeah, I mean, also like in chapter three, we have like white, 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 like, and it's always good to remind or to bring in an incredible work of art by an amazing Mexican director. Like, it's a great movie.
It was a great idea, a fantastic idea, and really puts it back into perspective that everybody has their story, and no one culture is more important than another. Um, it was
Yeah,
very
so
good.
that sort of like also kind of made me think of the sort of cloud of associations like
Mm,
that McCarthy sort of evokes by, using these words like, and in this particular long description, we have a bunch of short, with immigrants and Texans and Mexicans and with slaves and Lipan Indians and deputations of, and then that one just goes on as if McCarthy was saying, "Hey, reader, why don't you do a little bit of research?"
mhm, mhm. And this is not the only game in town.
Yeah,
There's a
exactly.
vibrant, diverse culture happening. There's intersectionality. There's borders and generations and
I remember also,
and
it says these these figures with their whispered taste for human flesh, right?
yeah.
So and that is historically accurate that it was thought,
Hmm.
obviously by, European settlers that that the Karankawas had cannibalistic practices. But I remember reading a source on them where it was like, I don't know, it was in again the 16th century or something, where some group of Karankawas encountered like some European settlers and they were starving and they were forced to cannibalism and that outraged the Karankawas. Isn't that
That's
hilarious?
amazing. That is hilarious. That is amazing. Because I was thinking Donner Party and the Andes and whatever, you
Yeah,
know.
that's
Oh my
right.
God.
But yeah, and then, the old disordered Mennonites, again, sort of like the Melvillian connection. Like when I read about this sort of like figure who's warning the protagonist away from their, the doomed enterprise that they're about to set out upon, it kind of reminded me a little bit about, or how in Moby Dick, before Ishmael takes off on the Pequod with Queequeg,
Hmm.
he goes to a famous chapel where there's this fiery minister, Father Mapple, who gives this sermon, about things, and it kind of, to me, it had a little bit of that vibe, like almost as if McCarthy was like self-consciously kind of echoing or repeating this kind of moment, again, as another sort of like baptismal entrance into something, right? Like we had at the end of chapter 2. And in this way, this is a warning away that the kid will obviously ignore.
Yes, you're
But
right.
and Father Mapple, like that sermon is so good. And,
Mm,
at one point, Father Mapple says, I recall him saying something like, woe to those who seek to please rather than to appall, and in a way that echoes Melville's own writing method, right? Like
mm,
he thought Moby Dick was I think he said, like, I feel innocent having written this book, but it's like the most devilish book or the most
mm.
wicked book,
Yes.
or something
No,
like
it's
that, right?
fabulous. Yeah.
And of course, like Cormac McCarthy is also a writer who would much rather appall than please his reader.
Correct. Yes, correct. It's going to do it until they force him to stop. Yeah, this is a very sad ending to this chapter, and we don't even know what happened. Or if we do, I missed it. How these things end in confusion and curses and blood. And they're out. Oh, I think also, are we learning that the kid's a bit of an alcoholic? Because after they get his kit, he's like, I've got an eagle here, a coin with a bird on it. We can still drink.
Yeah,
And I think that could be, what we're really finding out. He's come by it. Now we would know that it comes through families. I don't know if we knew it in 85 or not. Maybe. Maybe we knew it was
yeah,
hereditary. I have no idea. Um, but yeah, so the boy from Missouri, he doesn't make it. And
doesn't
it's
make
just so sad. They don't even remember what happened. And it's an offstage death. So that's
yes,
another foreshadowing.
yes, yeah, very nice. Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, yeah.
Mhm.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and offstage deaths usually indicate are a device of Greek tragedy, part of one of the devices of Greek tragedy, and indicate a false protagonist. So, he wasn't a big player, but it still is a bit of a foreshadowing, most
Again,
definitely.
like self-similar, we're back to
Well,
self-similarity again,
similar, yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, and in that, how these things end with, I think there's a line about, words that could not be put right again or something like that. And like that is, again, this is probably a stretch, but like in writing Blood Meridian
Mm-hmm.
or in writing any kind
Mm-hmm.
of literary art,
Mm-hmm.
that's your task, to put the words in the right order, like,
Damn,
and
you're
so,
right. Yes, yes.
so, like, and we know from archival material and critics who work on that McCarthy would, write a sentence,
Mm-hmm.
put it in one place, thought to himself, that doesn't work there, put the same sentence in a totally different place, move things around, like, you know I remember listening to a presentation, where the reader, I believe her name was Stephanie Heine, was talking about the geologic movements of McCarthy's like prose. It could just, one thing could pop up anywhere,
That's
and
true.
things move around like tectonic plates.
Yes, and I think he did have his files. I think they found in people who have gone to San Marcos, which we would like to do. We need to have a week of 2 weeks of us in San Marcos taking turns. Okay, you look
Oh,
for this and you look for that.
yeah.
Okay, here are notes tonight. Um, is that he did have specific writing that was in different novels, plans for in one novel, which he would go and hijack or harvest for another story. And
Yeah.
I think that's normal. I mean, I do that with artwork and painting. I often have sketches or something that goes to the side. It didn't go any further. Then I go and I'll literally sometimes glue it into a new painting,
Yeah.
just add it to a new painting. So I think that's part of writing and part of editing, but it is so fascinating. And write the right thing. You're right about that. One of the last interviews McCarthy did, He's at SFI, and he's pretty tired. He appears to be pretty tired, but it's a very good interview. I think it's with Krakauer. It's not with Krauss. That was not a good one. That one was, I don't know. I just didn't come away feeling good from it. But this one, he says something about what's the point of philosophy or poetry or talking if it's not moral? And I thought, wow, that's a very good thing to leave us with. We didn't know he was leaving then, but it's a very good final thing. So that I'm kind of saying that in response to, you've got to get the words right. Is this a war
Yes,
novel? Is it an anti-war novel?
yes.
Where are we going with it? Is there something? What's the subtext, or is there a subtext? And a lot of theories have been written about the novel, and you know,
Will continue to be.
and will continue to be, and that's part of the fun, and and that's where we're going.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the idea that, aesthetics should somehow be related to ethics,
Hmm.
that is a very old idea.
Isn't that is it older than
And
Kant?
well, it's probably older than Kant, but Kant really, I'm glad you mentioned him because, he will talk about aesthetics as related to our faculty for feeling pleasure and pain
Hmm.
rather than our, faculty of thought to determine knowledge or our faculty of desire to determine what's right. But he'll also say like art, is really just meant to be pleasurable, but in its pleasurableness, it becomes a kind of symbol of the good.
Hmm. Yeah.
And by the way, Kant was also, it would be in disagreement, I think, anyways, with the slaver that you were talking about at the beginning, because, for Kant, the critique of pure reason was the mind's attempt not to know the world, but to know itself before it could say anything and anything with certainty about the world. It
Right.
first of all had to know itself. So that's the critique of pure reason, just the mind looking at itself and its faculties and
Right.
determining what's what and realizing that space and time are not real, but forms of pure intuition and, blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say in Buddhism and in Hinduism, this is Maya, which is illusion. And everything that we see and do, we've created and we're imagining it. And to some people, it happened 10,000 years ago, even our conversation today. But it is an illusion, and it's the mind that's there to help us know that. When we don't know that, then we're just victim of the devices of our childhood or our culture or environment. The way we transcend is by realizing that the nature of reality is an illusion, that this is just one projection, um, one kind of dimension. And we agree with habit energy to keep maintaining it, you know, or habit energy or ego. And that it is that process of testing our minds that frees us. And art does too. And so something like reading this is loosening up our minds. It's loosening us up so we're free, and it
Yes,
may be the only freedom we have is in art and literature. It's
it
also
may
where,
be.
it's also where truth is. If you want to know something, you don't go to science or the law, you go to literature and art because that's where all the secrets are hidden. I was
Well,
trying to see if there was a correlation between the last sentence when he's in this thing with the final scene in the novel, but I couldn't find it. I was trying to see if there was a the word gate was in the last chapter, but I'll look that up later.
hmm.
Yeah, I was just looking for some more kind of haunting words and phrases.
Speaking of being haunted,
Yes.
like again, like back to Captain White's speech. We have the tacit support of Governor Burnett of California. Um, again, he's just like BSing and trying to impress the kid, and he's trying to persuade him like a confidence man.
Yeah.
But like looking into Governor Burnett of California is also kind of interesting thing. And I found a state of the state address. So he was the first, I think he was the last military governor of California before it became a state.
Ooh.
And then he was the first civilly elected governor. But he gave a state of the state address on January the 6th, 1851.
Oh my God.
So,
That's
January the
funny.
6th is a bad day in history, I guess.
Oh
Just try to,
man.
try to avoid January the 6th. But
Well, way to go.
on January the 6th, he gave a State of the Union address, and Burnett was a genocider, right? Like he was responsible for a lot of the massacres of indigenous people in California.
Ugh.
And he talks about natives in, a very conventional sort
Mhm.
of Anglo-Saxon supremacist
Mhm.
19th century kind of way, talking about how, for example, although these small and scattered tribes have among them no regular government, of course, he can't perceive any kind of government that is not, externalized in institutions. But
Mhm.
that he can't understand that maybe some laws are transmitted through stories.
Mhm.
Although these small and scattered tribes have no regular government, they have some ideas of existence as a separate and independent people, um, blah, blah, blah. But they instinctively consider themselves a doomed race,
Mhm.
right? So they, to quote other or to paraphrase other 19th century texts, they're they're past their meridian. They're in their
Ah,
evening redness, right?
yes, yes.
They instinctively consider themselves a doomed race, and this idea leads to despair and creates a hatred against the white man that never ceases to exist in the Indian bosom. You know,
Mhm.
all of this kind of demagoguery, we still hear this all the
All
time.
the
Like,
time.
it's
Yeah.
just like they've changed, like now it's more convenient. We
Mhm.
don't have to worry about indigenous people anymore. They've been taken care of, but let's talk about, I don't know, the Arabs or something like that, like,
Right.
and the Arabs are jealous of the West, and the Asians are jealous of the West, like it's the same thing over and over again.
Yes. Isn't January 6th kind of like a end of a holiday of a winter festival or a pagan festival? Is it also something like, is that the day that some people take down their Christmas tree, for example?
I don't know, yeah. It
Yeah.
could be like an Orthodox holiday, like
Orthodox, Greek Orthodox holiday, maybe, yeah.
I don't know, yeah.
Okay.
But I thought it
But
was
isn't
funny
it
that this
funny? It's
huge
hilarious. No, that's hilarious. Well, that's like when 9/11 happened. I looked up that something happened at Camp David that's, that it was an anniversary of a Camp David Accord. But it never
oh.
came out in the news, so I thought maybe I'm just being, paranoid, more paranoid than usual. Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank
I
you.
I want to say that we do have a Substack page for listeners. Thank you for listening. Thank you, John, and thank you to myself. This has been a lot of fun. I feel like I just really learned a lot. Um, we have a Substack page where we're going to put some extra content on, and also you could subscribe. And we're also hoping that you'll write reviews on our podcast page. If you When you go to the podcast, there's an opportunity, especially at least on iTunes, to write a review. And I promise to send prizes to I'll randomly pick hats out of if there's dozens and tens of people leaving reviews. If there's only one person leaving a review, definitely get a gift. But it will be some artwork or something original and something you'll like and something I can
Okay,
mail to you.
I'll leave a review.
Okay.
I'll be that one person.
Just do it on it. Yeah, I'll get my husband. Go write a review. No, we'd like to, we don't if you hate it, tell us. We want to know. Go ahead. We're willing to take a chance to encourage you to write a review, even if you think we're full of shit, or that you think, oh, this is okay, or not, or like, don't bother. We don't care. We hope you like it. We hope you're enjoying yourselves. We're certainly enjoying ourselves.
We do. We
Yeah.
hope to please you rather than appall you.
Yeah. True. That's McCarthy's job.
He can appall.
Already it is twilight.